Okay, good morning everyone for both here in the room and for those that attend through Zoom meeting. So welcome to today's public lecture where we'll talk about Southern Anthropocenes by Casper Bruun Jensen. So this public lecture is part of the Anthropology department at Universitas Indonesia, our team part of the department's objective. So before we start, I will give you a brief rundown for today's event or today's lecture. So this lecture will start by a presentation by Casper, and then there will be a response by our discussant by Irfan. And Casper himself is currently a professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. He is the author of Ontologies for Developing Things, published by Sense in 2010, and also the author of Monitoring Movements in Development Aid, along with papers published in 2015 by MIT Press. He is also the editor of Delusion Intersections, Science, Technology, Anthropology with Shetil Toshe, I hope I pronounced his name right, published by Bergen in 2009, and also the editor for Infrastructures and Social Complexity along with Penny Harvey and Katsugo Morita, published by Routledge in 2016. Casper focuses on climate, environments, infrastructures, and speculative and practical ontologies. Nugraha is currently a Ph.D. student in social anthropology at SOAS, University of London. He is currently working on a project about the reconfiguration of life at the solar water interface of the Citatas solar panel infrastructure. And there will be open discussion after the discussion session by Mas Irfan, and I guess there will be over now. And Casper, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. It wasn't a self-invitation to be here today. I'm very excited to get to talk about this project, which is a book project that basically just came out a month ago with Routledge and has taken all my energy for a couple of years. It's the first time I get to talk about it as a full time on the editing until now. By way of purpose, since it's a book project, I won't be giving an ethnographic exposition of the Southern Anthropocene, but rather a little introduction to it, set of motivating problems and concerns that led me to do this project, which has 23 chapters, I think 22, something like that, with people from pretty much all over the world exploring what we call Southern Anthropocene. I'll give a little bit of background. The early beginnings of this project can probably be traced back to 10, 15 years ago, the time where intense discussions around two different topics in anthropology emerged roughly at the same time. The ontological term and the Anthropocene as an issue or a problem. Back in 2013, I joined a roundtable on politics of ontology at the annual conference of AAA in Chicago. It was organized by Martin Goldberg and Morgan Phillips, featured Eduardo Rivera Castro, the big proponent of ontology in Latin American anthropology. And it was hundreds and hundreds of people, and it was super controversial. Many people were very excited about ontologies, and many of us were really angry about it, claiming that they took us back in time, essentialized, created a false image, founded an ahistorical cultures, prevented thinking about historical change, raised by exoticized and much else. At the same time, there was an equally controversial panel featuring Nugraha and Ph.D, which was perhaps even bigger, also exactly as controversial for the same reasons. And I suppose it was the next year, that the year 2014, I think, was the big year of the Anthropocene, again in American anthropology, where again Nugraha was featured as a keynote doing a super controversial presentation for, I think, anthropology at the time of the Anthropocene, where he described the Anthropocene as a poisonous gift. And the reactions were in a way quite similar, because the critiques of the Anthropocene that were emerging at the time, corresponded in a certain sense with critiques of the ontological term, namely the Anthropocene assumes singular human, not diversity, and ahistorical human. And more than anything, it sort of removes responsibility for those who are really responsible, removes responsibility for those who have created climate disruption, which are the capitalists of the rich north, by sort of leveling them on a par with indigenous villages that haven't done anything of the sort. So the idea of homogenization and reification, this time not a particular conscious of humanity. And evidently, these terms, both the Anthropocene and the ontologies, touch more nerves, but in both cases, I felt that the critiques also left much to be desired. And I was thinking about that for a long time, but writing this and that about Anthropocene and ontologies. But it was only during maybe COVID that, where I was on lockdown and on dead for a long time and had more than enough time to think about it, that I sort of figured out that I wanted to do something with this in partnership, not least as a collective endeavor after it, because it was traveling, and I began organizing this with Jeffrey Somebody in Chula, Longborn, and Arthur Melita at Rosa and others. We had some events, and then I started putting it together. So that is that's a sort of a little bit of background. I'll try to talk through where it is. I think Southern Anthropocenes is something quite distinctive from the singular Anthropocene, but also from the critiques of Anthropocene, and also how I think it connects with this interest in plural ontologies that proved so controversial around the same time. It's obvious that we have around us global Anthropocene signs, symbols, and figures, and the events are flooding the newspapers practically every day with fires, water, cities that may be sinking quickly or slowly, so that they need to be moved to different places. Here, for example, but also in Bangkok, roughly the same kind of problem. They just don't talk about it. Wildfires sweeping the Amazon in Australia, the hockey stick curves that are going infinitely up, never stop, and so on. So we do have global planetary signs that are all very troubling. But at the same time, variations in terms of the specifics of what is going on is also visible every time. Fires are not exactly the same in the Amazon as they are in Australia, and floods are not exactly the same in Northern Europe, where they're now getting more prevalent, as they are in Jakarta or Semarang. Yes. So the premise here, I'm just sort of stating it, hypothesizing or affirming it, of the book, is that pluralization of the singular Anthropocene is crucial because of the variations across the planet. And the idea based on that sort of affirmation is that there would be something to learn collectively as intellectual communities if we multiply the scenes here playing on the notion of an Anthropocene in the singular. Multiplying the scenes, looking at them carefully, thinking about them carefully from very many different perspectives, together or in interesting configurations or constellations. And the idea would be then to, gonna look down at my note here, to ask what happens, for example, in urban centers, or along the rivers, or in the forests, in the deserts, or even in the skies. How forms of life and worlds transform, and what responses are emerging from communities, activists, or other collectives. How do people reconstitute worlds faced with slow violence or sudden devastation? And what about forms of social and environmental justice, including for more than humans? So the book then was conceived as a map of variations that encourages collective learning through empirical divergence. But not only empirical divergence, and this is the second point that I'll be spending quite a bit of time on for this talk, conceptual divergence too. For if we look to the ideas or theories or dreams that are used to enact, confront, or grapple with all these different scenes, processes, and events, we once again find variation everywhere. Of course, there are dominant frameworks and visions, for example, the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. And yet, nobody agrees more than partially, and they don't agree for very long. When you look across the intellectual communities that are concerned with these issues, we are very far from a harmonious chorus. So the claim in the Southern Anthropocene is that that's not a problem. Social structures and integrated systems are bad fantasies, as well as poor tools for collective learning and practical action. It's more fruitful to think of a tangle of pathways that partially connect settings, problems, and modes of thought. They make travel and communication between different places and ideas possible with more or less difficulty. None of them are perfect or innocent, but some are potentially inventive and generative. So that is that's pretty much what's going on in the book as an overall sense. A map of empirical variations from many places towards the end of this talk. I'll just point at what they are. I can't do them justice. There's too much going on, so I'm just going to point at what they are in case anybody wants to look at it. But also a map of conceptual variations. It's not a matter of getting rid of all the cherished Western sorts of theories, but it's a matter of creating leeway for other kinds of ideas to infiltrate or infect and transform those dominant frameworks. And so for that reason, the movement in this presentation, as in the introduction, goes first through Southern theories, epistemologies, and dialogues, and the problem with some dominant Northern ways of understanding them, in my opinion, and then into the question of what would be required for creating or inventing new portals between some of the intellectual communities dealing with these issues that have difficulties talking with each other, except in terms of mutual critique and hostility. And yeah, so there's a kind of double movement going on in that, in the introduction and in this presentation along those lines. As I said, kind of repeating from the last slide, first there's a question of Northern attempts to activate Southern theories and epistemologies, which I'm going to talk in a moment about why I find that to be not entirely satisfying in the form they've taken so far. And then there's the attempt that is going on in the book, which takes us from contact zones, a particular kind of idea, to critical zones, another kind of idea, and onwards into pluriversal contact zones, which kind of combines and augments some of this, the previous ones. That movement will raise various kinds of questions. This is a phrase that comes from the Critical Zones book, edited by Latour before he died, and Peter Weibel, that has really stuck with me. That the situations we are in with climate disruption all over the world raise a bunch of very troubling questions for different collectives, including who are we now that we're realizing that we're surely not just human collectives anymore, but that we are sustained by a great many kinds of inhuman processes relating to climatic flows, water flows, fire, energy, and so on, but also a great many biological and other entities that had stayed in the background for the years in which social theory and anthropology focused primarily on epistemologies and power relations and colonialism in a humanized framework, you could say. How many are we? Evokes the same type of question, I would say. It's like, how many are we? Can we in Indonesia count our collectives only in terms of people, or must we count, as Latour said, birds and earthworms, bees and pollinators, and so on? And if we start counting them, how would that require us to rethink understandings of politics and ways of belonging? Where are we, and which futures are we headed towards? I mean, I want to focus on the when are we. This is a question that Latour asks also, and that sounds strange, but I find very, very interesting. The when are we? Of course we are, if we are in a Western Gregorian calendar anyway, we're in 2025, others are in different years, but it seems logical that we are in the year we're in. But what he means by asking the question is, are we in a period that it's still possible to think of in terms of state stability or progress, or are we heading backwards towards times that we associated in the West with barbarianism and war and slaughtering each other? Now that we get more and more climate refugees and so on, are we headed forward into a good Anthropocene where everything will be solved by technology? When are we? Which pathways are we on, and where are we headed? All these questions are being raised at the same time. And so the proposition that the book also explores is that, by and large, the politics and the science, both in practical terms, but also in sort of visionary terms, I call it speculative terms, require all these different zones, where we're thinking about Jakarta, whether we're thinking about Poland or South Africa. The politics and the science required for the zones to remain livable as we get deeper into planetary transition, as indexed by all these hockey stick figures, are largely unknown. That is, the methods and the ideas and the solutions that our politicians come up with and work towards are evidently not going to work. But it's not like there are too many great ideas for how to actually solve the issues. It's like there are many blockages and there are many frustrations about things not happening. But so far, limited capacities for coming up with ways of doing it differently. We probably should get started on that as well, on top of the critiques that we do like to develop. I want to say a little bit about Southern, because no doubt that is an unusual word in a way, and I've already been asked many times, like, why on earth are you talking about Southern? And I must say that I think, to begin with, the reason was that I was doing this from Cambodia, Phnom Penh, southern and tropical country. But it's not the good reason. It was just like why I think I thought of the term to begin with. So let me say a little bit about Southern and the justification and why I do like the term, despite its problems as well. The important thing here is that Southern cannot just be a geographical domain or marker. We did used to have, not so long ago, an east-west polarity in the world. That's how it was talked about, right? The Cold War, and the east was the Soviet, and the west was communisms and capitalists and so on. And that polarity, of course, was never really completely correct, because there were also Western countries in the East and Eastern countries in the West, but it was used to sort of think about the divisions, and that played out in many dramatic ways it also led to, in part, it was a driver in what is now called the great acceleration of all these kinds of Hobby curves, because both on the western side, of course, there was a sort of consumption drive to create what Susan Buck-Morse has called the dreamscapes of capitalism, where everybody would be wealthy and happy and have a television and so on. But it was also matched, or attempted to be matched, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, where communists also extracted violently from nature in order to create their versions of dreamscapes. So fighting together, everybody extracted more and more. But East-West never really worked to begin with, and after the, in terms of as a geographical marker only, and after the fall of the wall, we started talking much more about North and South, right? Global South, and so suddenly it's going not this way but this way. It's sort of like the Global South needs to catch up, and globalization will or will not support that catching up. Again, I don't think the Global South is a very strong geographical marker. It's a sort of symbol of something, which raises surely the issue. This is why I'm touching on it here. Why talk about South then if you don't want the Global South? Furthermore, why talk about South when you risk leaving out many interesting places on the Earth? For example, I have one in the Southern Anthropocenes book. I have a chapter by Olga Ulturgasheva, who writes about the Russian Arctic. And she said yes, and then she almost didn't write the chapter because she was like, I can't fit in a book that's Southern. For us, colonialism came from the South. Because they're the most north, like, so obviously it was the Russians or Danes or somebody else moving up and killing people and stealing. And so Southern sounds not so universal and problematic in various ways. But for me, what is important are the following things here. I would say it defines a different kind of conceptual topography. One aspect of it is to realize, this is from Komarov and Komarov, that in terms of geographies, there's plenty of north in the south and vice versa, as they say. That means that, for example, African, southern type environments in Europe, so the south is in the north, and they're also sort of rich capitalist and colonialist pockets, plenty of them in the so-called south. So you have a sort of fractal landscape to begin with. What I would combine it with to give a vibrancy to the term is, I would say, Southern for me indexes things like the subaltern that came, I believe, with the Indians, Kura and Spivak and so on, but also what the legends like Mario and Marisol de la Cadena talk about as the uncommons, rather than a common world, and uncommons full of confusing perplexities, perplexing realities that coexist. And I would also combine it with the undercommons that Fred Moten and other African scholars talk about as sort of the undercurrents that manage to exist and infect and seep through the dominant institutional domains in the US, for example. So the Southern is everything that sort of creeps up through the crevices and changes the dominant frameworks here. And I think, to tie it back to the tropical sort of, like I was sitting in Phnom Penh, I think that I associate it with the fact of proliferation and propagation under hot and humid conditions. I mean, this idea that, contrary to the cold Denmark, things are always changing, modifying, turning into something else because the conditions are right with it in a certain way. So it's a matter for me both to speak of sort of what creeps up everywhere and changes, challenges, and creates an experimental space in a lively and vibrant manner. That means that we are not stuck and static in a certain manner. Now, I want to connect that a little bit with what I said before, the problems of northern ways of dealing with this. I call it Dreams of the North here. One of the things I mentioned at the very beginning was that when we got the Anthropocene debates, the scientists, at least many scientists, were saying, well, the Earth is now in an Anthropocene era, and many social scientists agreed with that, and many others disagreed violently with that, since, as I said, it's a universalizing category that presents man rather than specific types of men as the reason. Now we have the cats. But the thing that happens in that discussion is what replaces the universal Anthropocene? Well, the universal Capitalocene. The universal Capitalocene comes instead. Now, who came up with capital? That was, I think it was Marx. So it means that rather than having some particular Western scientists defining a universal category that we all live in, then we have another Western social, political, economical theorists defining the conditions we're all living in. And moreover, we later get other versions capturing everything, like Anak sings. I mean, I'm very fond of the plantation scene of Feral Atlas and so on. But this kind of discussion among the northern universities and their elite scholars about who has the right to define the correct terms for the situation that we're all in, and who has the best and biggest one, I find that quite problematic. Not just because it deletes a lot of stuff, ways of thinking from all over the world, but also because it seemed to me at the time that the major issue for many of these academics was sort of figuring out who gets the right to name something. Whereas the less important thing was how to develop collective alliances and ways of being together in difference that could do something about it. And there's a term that this is from the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson from his book 2312, I think, where he did, one of the persons in that book describes retroactively what the planet Earth was like around 2020 to 2050 as the dithering. And dithering is sort of aimlessly wandering around without really getting around to doing anything substantial, sort of. And so that, of course, refers to the lack of political and practical will to get anything done about the really big issues that are confronting us. But for me, that also related to this kind of interminable discussion about who has the right term for the situation. I was reading at the time a book by David Kopenhauer, an absolutely fantastic book and strongly commendable if you haven't come across it. It exemplifies also the ontological turn in a certain way because it's a book written from the perspective of a shaman, but it's not about his local existence in the world. It's about how he understands the whole world. So this Kopenhauer, he became a spokesperson for his people. He traveled to Rio first, then he traveled to Paris and London and spoke as one of the indigenous leaders. But in the book he's describing the world he's encountering as he's doing the traveling, and it's all from the point of view of living with spirits and spirit houses and various beings. And so, for example, he'd see the Eiffel Tower as an enormous spirit house, but one that's been deserted, one that's fallen apart. And he'd see Stonehenge. He has an interpretation of that, and he has interpretations of what's going on with pollution and the problems with living in big cities, how it weakens and desiccates the soul. He has a whole complete theory of the world from the point of view of the Amazon. That's amazing. It's an amazing book. But he says at a certain point in time here, and this connects with the dithering, the white people, they do not dream as far as we do. They sleep a lot, but only dream of themselves. Their thought remains blocked and they slumber like tapirs or turtles. And this kind of thing, they sleep a lot, but only dream of themselves, like this kind of white narcissism that's going on here. This is something I would connect with the stuff up here, that even when you have the supercritical capitalocene people, it reverts back to the question of like who has the best theory of capital. It's still dreaming the same kind of dream. Now it's a counter capitalist dream. It's a communist dream or anti-capitalist, but it's the same thing again, and it's still defined in terms that come from the north. So the question for me has always been here, like with the Capitalocene, for example, are we to imagine that everything is to be explained in the same manner from Argentina to Chad to Hungary to Indonesia, in the same manner and identifying the same kind of problems? Is that not a kind of problem in terms of intellectual decolonialism too, that the concepts that are allowed to make a difference for grappling with these kind of really serious problems we have are so strictly denominated in Western and Northern terms? So the question for me is, are we endlessly stuck with our own dreams if we West also, or could we learn to dream something different? Well, that would require that we get inputs from other places and allow ourselves to be touched or nourished in some different ways, rather than expecting only that the traffic goes from Europe or the US and so on, and everywhere else. So there are various examples, and so this is also the reason why, another unmentioned reason why I wanted to talk about Southern is because some other Westerners have talked about Southern. There are a couple examples here that I think are all famous examples. So you have Raymond Connell, an Australian, I think, a sociologist who made a real effort in Southern theory. It's already 20 years ago, to carve out a new path, insisting that the South is a generator of theory, not just a set of case studies, but a generator of theory. And she has various examples, including certain forms of Islamic thinking, I think, certain form of traditional African philosophy, and other ideas. So she did that. It never really caught on, I guess, and there are also some issues with it that I'll touch on in a second. Epistemologies of the South by Boaventura de Sousa Santos likewise makes a similar gesture. Of course, the subtitle of the book, I think, is Against Epistemocide. I don't know if we can pronounce this word, but epistemocide must be the murder of epistemologies, and the epistemologies that are murdered are all those that do not conform to the North again. And so he has a very long and heavily theorized critique of epistemocide, but at the same time, his way of critiquing it is by way of Western theory. I mean, so, and meanwhile, theory from the South by Komarov and Komarov, who I mentioned positively before, there's a lot of South in the North, I said, and North in the South. Yes, indeed, but at the end of the day, what happens is that they conclude with their examples from South Africa that the South is the future of the North, and it seems to be the geographical South that's the future of the geographical North. And the kind of future it is, it's one that's going downhill due to sort of neoliberal extractivist logics. So theories from the South means that you reapply some kind of structural articulation, deterministic theory, and then you kind of ironically laugh at the fact that things will also be bad for the North later on. And for me, I react very poorly to this kind of logic, not because I love everything bad North has done, but because this type of ironic reversal, it doesn't solve anything, and moreover, it only works well if you accept or embrace the totalizing logic to begin with, that there's really two blocks and there's one pathway through history. It's just not going better, it's going to go worse instead. So the problem we see across these books, in a way, is that that Southern theories are not, in a sense, allowed enough room to grow. Like in each of them, you find, this is just a sort of synopsis, in each of them you have an affirmation of the significance of Southern modes of thought, but then when you get to sort of spelling out what are the issues, you end up with things like global hegemonies, structural violence, epistemic hierarchies, and related terms, all of which come from critical social thought of the North. They are what enframes the claim that it would be important to do something different, but they can't do it themselves. They're not willing to, in a way, go far enough with it. Now, so what's going on in the book in order to, in an effort to open up space where something else can happen? For me, there are three kinds of movements here. You may know Mary Louise Pratt's very famous book on contact zones and the contact zone. If you do not know or do not remember, it's kind of this extracted from linguistics, I think is the correct thing, where you find people that come from different places, need to meet temporarily, and they need to communicate. They develop creoles or pidgins, as it used to be called, and maybe the simplified grammar, simplified modes of expression, but it works well enough for people to get along doing the kinds of things they need to do together. Trade and make relations and so on. Obviously, this is also a trading zone or contact zones are also unequal sites, as we know from the colonial worlds, where the traders come over and extract and belittle and do other things, but it's also creative zones where new things emerge. That's very important. There's creative transformational zones of encounter under uneven conditions. That's the contact zone, and that's imperialized. Over there, where you have an Indian carrying a conquistador of the Andes, by the way. Yeah. Now, one of the things that contact zones did not do, and maybe could not do, was think of non-humans. It was a fully humanized entity, the contact zones as originally described. It doesn't have to be, but it was. Critical zones, on the other hand, came in with, over the last 20 years, as a mode of understanding particular things in the earth sciences, where different scientific collectives realized that they could not really understand what makes life possible in particular areas, as long as they stayed within monodisciplinary frameworks. You need to have both hydrologists and geologists and other gists work together to define new problems and study together. And they can characterize these areas that we're able to live in on the planet as critical zones. The critical zone is an area that stretches down to the groundwater and up to the top of the tree canopies. And if you go further down, you cannot live there unless you are some kind of bacteria. And if you go higher up, you also cannot live there. So that means that this is a critical zone in that if you look from the point of view of the whole Earth, it's very thin. It's like a thin film that surrounds the entire planet, and that's actually all we have. It's also referred to as the fragile skin of the Earth, which is a great phrase. I think we all live in or on the fragile skin of the Earth. We really need to figure out how that skin can maintain its livability, and we need a lot of different knowledges for that. One of the things that highlights that's different from the contact zone are all the non-humans. Right? We need water, we need nutrients, we need energies, and we're not actually sure how these things work together. It's really important to figure it out. Otherwise, the critical zone could go into a critical condition and we'd be in even more trouble. So we have contact zones with politics and human exchange. We have critical zones with all these flows. And in the hands of Arturo Escobar and Marisol de la Cadena, it then becomes pluriversal critical zones, contact zones, where the ontologies return once again. The pluriverse indexes the idea that we do live in many different kinds of worlds that are populated by many different kinds of beings. There are non-humans, a lot of them, but also there are things that are not non-humans, but more than humans. For example, in Marisol's work, there are earth beings, and earth beings are not the same as mountains. And in Cambodia, there are crocodile beings, and they're not the same as crocodiles, but they do sustain the crocodiles and the people that live with them. But of course, if you ask scientists, earth beings and crocodile beings do not exist. So there's a problem. And the question is, if we're looking not at the Anthropocene as defined by science, but at Southern Anthropocenes, how to tackle the problems that not only do we have people, and not only do we have lots of flows of things that are measurable by scientific means, but also we have a lot of other entities. Cambodia too has many, many other entities that do mean a great deal to various different collectives, but not in the same way and controversially, and some people will insist they don't exist. Sometimes they'll be willing to kill others for the fact that they do exist. This creates a new set of problems. Now, so when I listed all these things here, you notice that I've said much, in a way, skeptical about homogenizing theories. Like, I don't believe in this and that. I haven't said so much about a replacement theory, and nor will I do that, because I think that's part of the problem. I think that we do have a great many challenges collectively in different parts of the world, but also across, and we do have a dearth of imagination in terms of how to deal with all the challenges we're going to be facing. Therefore, it's a bad strategy to imagine that we must search for a common denominator or find out who has the best and biggest theory. We need, as I say here, all the help we can get. We need all the help we can get, and especially because in Europe, for example, you see, we're talking empirically here in Europe, we're now getting flooded. We're not good at getting flooded, because we've not been flooded for many years. Now, I think people in Indonesia don't like being flooded, but you're probably better at being flooded, because you have a lot of experience with it. But, so we need all the help we can get. Means learning in different directions. In this time, flooding. Dutch people love to travel the world and tell people how to build flood structures. But we need all the help we can get. Means there are potentially good reasons for movements in other directions. So too conceptually. So I've just listed a bunch of things here that I think are interesting, and it doesn't matter. Maybe you can't even read it. Post-colonial thought, political ecologies, material semiotics, cosmopolitics, poetics of relation, indigenous fictions, and much else, and others, of course. It's an open-ended list, because the point is not to tell everybody what Southern Anthropocenes really are or should be. It is to open a collective space where it's possible to learn through mutual challenge, I would say. And this is where the idea of portals come in the book, and it's one that people in the chapters seem to enjoy a lot. The notion of portals as something that has the potential to connect entities, for example, thought collectives, and transform them, but do not always do it for various reasons. Thought collectives can have relations that are blocked either through indifference, or unnoticed through indifference, or they can be blocked deliberately, or they can be obstructed accidentally, so that the means of figuring out how to learn from intellectual communities across difference is how to do that becomes a challenge that is really important to solve in order to give different possibilities for thinking and acting a chance. And I'll just mention a couple of things here. I think this is something maybe you're not familiar with portals language. I think I took it from science fiction. Right? Sometimes you can imagine you step into a portal, you don't know what
happens at the other side. Maybe you come out in a bad way at the other side, or into in a situation where you're going to be eaten by something. But you could also step into something and find new allies. The thing is that a portal is a sort of risky and potentially transformative event, but it's necessary to take the risk of doing something else to not get stuck with where we are now. And when I say that in relation to our intellectual communities, it is because we do like to fight each other based on our proclivities. So that if you are inspired by Bruno Latour, you must always have a fight with people who don't like Bruno Latour because they think neoliberal. I had this discussion 4,000 times, and each and every time it's the same discussion. The portals that would allow something else to happen are blocked. We cannot. And what I'm saying is, Southern Anthropocenes is about inventing portals, not between each and everything. I don't want to invent a portal with fascists. I don't have an interest in that. But I do want to learn from many others that seem to be different or even annoying, but not dangerous. And we need to learn that together. I give 3 examples here. For example, those who are into the coloniality of knowledge and connect colonialism not just with violent practices, but also with epistemological colonialization. It's again Latin America. They are, per definition, always very skeptical of Western science. It's a colonial enterprise. And it's understandable, but at the same time, how are we supposed to deal with critical zones and the flows that sustain the fragile skin of the earth if we can't think with science, not uncritically, but we got to learn to think about that not as an anti-relation to decolonial perspectives. So it's important there to think through disunified sciences, where some of them may be completely colonial, but others are not. So the relation is contingent, not essential, and you could imagine different sorts of relation, and some people are imagining. Just one example. Down here, something similar. There are those that are very much into entanglements these days, including myself, and before entanglements it was connections, relations, other things that think through relationalities that expand in many directions. You can see that all over my presentation. That's what I'm doing. But for those who feel threatened in their existence, for example, in Latin America or indigenous communities, they don't want to be entangled too much. They have the problems that they're already feeling much too entangled. They want to protect their enclosures so they don't get run over and absorbed by what is stronger than them. And that too is very important and understandable. And yet you can't avoid entanglements either, because they are there. So the portal will be, in this case, about learning how to filter and sort entanglements so they don't become destructive for those who are vulnerable and need to protect themselves. We again don't know how to have these discussions unless you can get beyond the initial sort of hostility. And the patchy Anthropocene, just to mention, and since since we're here, I'm very fond of the patchy Anthropocene actually, because the patchiness has a lot of relation to the southern sort of fractals that I'm talking about. But when you talk about the plantation machine, it often becomes a sort of updated natural history. And what is left out of that in terms are other ways of dealing with plantations that also do exist and that are generative in other terms. And here I just mentioned, like Edouard Glissant's The Poetics of Relation, which specifically was developed via plantation experiences in the Caribbean. We don't know how to update natural history with a poetics of relation or the other way around, but it would be interesting. So it's this kind of, we don't know, but it could be interesting. That's motivating all this stuff. So I'm just, it's just going to be the last 5 minutes or so. I'll just say a little bit. These are teasers for what is inside the book. And this is my many great contributors and co-authors. I hope you look at not all of it, but some of it. The book is organized in these sections. The first is called the sort of generic headings that I think are characteristic of many or all of the pluriversal contact zones. So you have emergent interfaces, like contact zones pluriversal, but they're coming into being. We don't have them yet, but they're happening now, so we don't know what their characteristics are. And here we have nuclearized landscapes, right? We think immediately of Fukushima, of course. We have haunted ships with medical waste rotting in the harbors of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Nobody wants them, and they're falling apart and seeping into the ocean, destroying everything. An emergent sort of medical necro landscape. We have from Thailand old militarized ships that are turned into coral reefs, trying to turn something destructive into something that is generative. And we have Chilean mining in the Chilean deserts. Problems of coexistence is one of my favorite terms for all of this, because I think it's something the pluriversal concept sounds really basic. Invariably problems of coexistence that go beyond the human. The fact is that it's not the requirements for being able to live in a decent way are not the same for an ostrich and a human and a tiger, not to mention an earth being or a nuclear plant. So in all these situations you end up with difficult questions. I would say they're cosmopolitical, but because they concern the question of what world are we going to live in and how can we live together? Can ghosts live with a nuclear plant? Can tigers live with a city? Can something else live? And how do you negotiate the differences? You can't just do entanglements and say everybody must live happily together, because we do eat each other and kill each other for good and bad reasons. All things are not compatible. So there are always difficult problems of coexistence. For example, in polluted Indian fishing villages among plastic spreading everywhere because everybody hates plastic, but at the same time, here we are spreading it and we won't get rid of it because what will we do? We depend on it. Forest and landscapes torn by war. Many problems of coexistence. Likewise, the question inversely of livable worlds. This is a generative question, not just like what is the matter with all these things going on now, but what would livability, meaning not just survivability, but livability in the medium to long run mean? What would it involve? What would it require? What kind of philosophies might underpin it? Feeding into that more broadly speculations. Since we don't have all the theories and ideas that we need in order to probably survive very well in many years, I think speculation is a really interesting rubric that has emerged over the last 10, 15 years especially. Everybody wants to speculate these days, and I think, and not necessarily here, but in many places, and I think it has to do with the sense that many of our cherished social theories are not really working as well as they used to. It's not that they're awful or that they're all wrong or anything, but Foucault, knowledge and power is not as good for dealing with climate disruption as it is for dealing with social political formations in France. And other ideas are also not as good, but we don't know what would be good enough. And I think this is what is driving this increasing interest in looking broadly in many directions, including, for example, this interest in indigenous fictions, indigenous speculations, also in the West in science fictions. And I've read anthologies of Southeast Asian climate fiction that's speculating about what Manila or parts of Java could be, should be, or would be in 50 years, and feeding that back into questions of like how our pedagogies for learning things now are and how they could change is something that's an issue in the speculation sections. More than human itineraries sort of it's self-explanatory in a way. It's the question of like how things that are not human are walking through our worlds and what they're doing and how they change us and how we relate to them. And Mr. Tufail here has an example about cats in Georgia, especially, and my friend Oil Chula has something about migratory birds and migratory migrant worker communities coming together in a particular context zone in Bangkok, southern Thailand. for part of the year they meet. The birds and the people all are temporary, none are really welcome, and yet they are part of sustaining one group. So, and entangled territories, here my font is for entanglements, I would say all kinds of things again, melting ice in Siberia, bombings by Israel in South Lebanon, the entanglements and destructions that are going on in various places, Californian entanglements with Philippine immigrant communities also there. So that's some of the stuff that's in the book, and since I'm basically at the right time, I'll just summarize, I think, what the major point, maybe repeating myself slightly here, ends and beginnings, because I don't think, I hope this book is not an ending, but an invitation to thinking with many people. A bunch were in the book and many are not in the book, but there could be extended conversations leading from that. That's what I would hope. When it comes to the Anthropocene and ongoing dramatic Earth transformations, it's super important to multiply the empirical points of reference so we don't get always the same kind of storylines about the burning of this place and the flooding of this place. These things do happen and they are very important, but there are also many other things that are not burning and flooding, but doing some other stuff. And Southern Anthropocenes is about bringing to light the variation in what it means to live with these changes that are happening. And that's very important, but so far that's only empirical, so to speak. So the second part is, it's not just that there are many kinds of things going on, it's also that there's a great variety of ways of thinking about those things and making sense of them. So that the Anthropocene singular is insufficient, but so is it to say, well, here too capitalism is at fault, but here too capitalism did it, but there capitalism did it. Yeah, indeed, probably capitalism and colonialism has a hand in almost everything, but it is deadening, and I don't think it's generative in the sense of creating possibilities for moving on and figuring out what to do, because the end point of so much of it is that, well, in that case, we must overthrow capitalism, but we can't do that today, so we'll do another critique of it. Northern neglect of the capacities of southern modes of thought diminishes potentials for inventing collective responses to planetary problems, and they could rather be elevated by learning from different modes of thinking about the variety of problems. So, and this is just pure provocation here. I alluded to Kopenhauer before. For him, what we call pollution is Sawara epidemic fumes. Sawara is a particular kind of spirit, it doesn't matter for these purposes. The Sawara epidemic fumes threaten the sky with collapse. His book is called The Falling Skies. What if his diagnosis of the Sawara epidemic fumes threatening the sky with collapse was treated with the same seriousness as the Anthropocene or Capitalocene? What would be the modes of forging ahead, of thinking about ways of dealing with the threat of collapse of the skies as seen via this mode of thinking? It's not that he has the correct answer, it is that the answer is going to look partly similar and partly different, and there's something important to learn from the divergence. He wrote that book already, of course, and as I said, you should read it. But likewise, there's so many other possibilities for exploration along those lines. So what transformations might African earth philosophies, or here with a nod to old Java, the Javanese form of power, which I stole from Benedict Anderson, and I won't try to pronounce it. The Javanese form of power. What might such ideas and concepts introduce, how might they be used to transform or modify or challenge or illuminate or unburden or loosen singular conceptions of the Anthropocene? I'm not saying these are great ideas, maybe they're awful ideas, I'm not in a position to tell, but what possibilities might there be from scavenging, looking around and learning with all these people out in the world that do have formal philosophies and informal thoughts of many kinds that are not tapped into when we only treat them as empirical cases. So, and this is the mantra of the book, I think, in the end, yeah, we don't know that but perhaps we could try to find out, and perhaps we might be enriched in the process.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, it's like exactly 1 hour since we start. I'm sure we have a lot of things to discuss, but before I open the floor, I'm going to Mas Irfan for a discussion.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Casper, for your inspiring presentation. And when yeah. I think first of all that yeah. I think when you are talking about the Southern Anthropocene, I think it felt to me like to entering the conversations about what the Anthropocene is and about what the South is. And your presentation like invite us to listen, to talk, and also thinking differently, and to notice, especially to notice about how the world or our life are constantly being made and remade through many things in the southern dimension, like maybe in our everyday life, like the infrastructure, maybe the ecologies, maybe spirits and everything. And I think what stands out for me when you are doing the presentation is when you are it's not only the critic about the dominance in shaping global thinking, but also the way we open space for our thinking otherwise, not from above, but I think it's very important that we reflect that from the within the tangle, messy, also the fragile relation life. I think it's very important to us, especially for me, to think about the Southern Anthropocenes. And it becomes more interestingly when you ask about what happened when the Anthropocene meets with the many words of the source. So so this is like the overflow about too many ways of being, too many forms of life, too many words, but they do not fit neatly into one of the definition about the human itself or the Anthropos itself. And I think you like to invite us to how the anthropology needs to learn to live and think within this tension without always trying to resolve them. And it is significant ideas when you invite us to think about the song itself as not just like fixed topography placed on the map, that instead that thought is maybe like a become condition or that's set by the history of extractive or inequality and dependency. But for me it's also like inspire us to think about the thought as the condition for the creativity and also the imaginations. In this sense, I think like many of us maybe where people maybe find ways to live other ways to get something different from the within the difficult of the condition on the southern part of the world. It's way to like when we are thinking about the how we like thinking about how the way of the composing life itself, like I think it's full fragile, full experimental, but there is yet a full of the potential in the future. And maybe, and also if I found like compelling when you are talking about, when you reflect about the thought as pluriversal complexities. When I think it's interesting when you are talking about like this like the in between or the liminal spaces where the worlds meet, overlaps, and sometimes collide. Yeah, not only a physical spaces, but also the ethical ones, where the coexistence must be negotiated in our everyday life. For me, it's like when we are thinking about the living together, it's not like a just script or the problem of the life, but it's just like, yeah, maybe I just felt like that their life is never smooth, I think. It involves like the uncertainty, tension, and also the endurance for us. And your presentation reminds us about this kind of the fragility, and maybe it's just maybe just like the when we are reflecting about what I call about the condition, the Southern Anthropocene, maybe just like the condition for us to to understand what our life itself. And another point that stay with me is the word of the speculation. Maybe for me or many of us, yeah, when we are talking about the speculation, it's not an escape or the fantasy, but it's also one of the form of the care, I think. When we are talking speculation, maybe in my personal experience, and maybe of many of us in the Southern, when we are talking about speculation, is talking about the care itself. And also, I found in your section about talking about the section about the novel of the dream of the knowledge. So what I mean about the speculation is the care is speculation, maybe as you put, is about running to care what might be possible. I think we must do thinking about. I think this very, you know. What I mean there is when you are speculation is learning to care about what may be possible, even the future feel uncertain. I think it's still keep remain open to new way of the many possibilities rather than something the future is big itself. And finally, I think your presentation is offered about how we are thinking, or maybe maybe as for me as a researcher, maybe thinking about how we are the anthropology. Maybe the anthropology student thinking how we must work with it, moving alongside, and its vulnerability about Southern Anthropocenes, and maybe the practice of companionship, or maybe of joining those who are imaging and changing their life differently, and maybe is one of our role in talking the Southern Anthropocene. So for the closing, I think I think your presentation is just like a call for humility. We know that the earth maybe cannot unify under one story, but it can be lived with patiently, attentively, and also with care. Have with this, maybe it's the task of us to thinking or imagining about the Southern Anthropocene itself, to help to keep the world open to the other ways of being, thinking, and also the caring that already happening. So maybe I will closing with some question for you if you don't mind. So maybe my first question is, as you described that about the multiplicity as a condition of life in the Anthropocene, how can the anthropology stay open for this multiplicity? Because maybe when we are talking about talking about difference rather than living with it, And maybe for the second and the last is, can you say more about the potential on how we study and write in the Southern Anthropocene, or the act of writing the story of the Southern Anthropocene? Maybe that's my brief discussion on this for your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you repeat the first one?
The first one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe my question is how anthropology stay open for this multiplicity without showing it from another academic vision.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think anthropologists are great at that. I think there's almost nobody better at staying open to multiplicity than anthropologists. for starters, because it's part of good ethnographic practice to not sort of foreclose what it is you come across. And I do think that anthropologists are very good at that. I say sorry, anthropologists generically, because I'm only anthropologist by association. I became sort of anthropologist, I am not. But I think that what maybe often does some of the foreclosing of actual attentiveness to multiplicity are conceptual frameworks that direct you toward into certain kinds of groups. That is, if you're an environmental anthropologist, you're going to be looking for particular sorts of things, obviously. If you're an infrastructure one, you will have an inclination to study certain kinds of things. And so there's a kind of theoretical ways of unnoticing through having to study stuff in a controlled manner under the time pressure, basically. I mean, so I think, I mean, you could say my answer to the question is, I see where it is. It's this movement, basically. I mean, if you think, I think Mary Louise Pratt is great. It's a fantastic book. Many others wrote fantastic books at the time, studying a great variety of things. And they were multiple things, but they were multiple within the human realm. So having been practiced in studying those kinds of things, the environment became a context, a more or less pacified context in which it was going on, right? So it's not that there was a lack of attention to multiplicity, it is that the particular multiplicity just cut at a certain point, because these were the sorts of things that were interesting. I mean, once you came, critical zone is a bit different here, because Latour and this came into STS, but it was originally natural science. But if we say the old Latour, the huge breakthrough, I would say, of actor network theory and the old Latour, which was so controversial at the time, was to say contact zones, networks, we got to think about the non-humans within. And back in the time, in the late 80s and 90s, everybody thought this was the most stupid thing you could imagine. Everybody hated it. Right? Everybody was into discourse and social construction. The idea of non-human agency was ridiculed for years. I don't know how many times I was told things like, how can you interview a train? Or how can you, like, they don't have agency, they're just mechanical things. So there was no interest in it, right? And eventually, these days, of course, everybody says non-human agency as if it's nothing. It's totally obvious, and people still don't like Latour, but they do like the idea without Latour. And I think the point is that you learn gradually attentiveness to another multiplicity, that actually we live with our environments as active contributors. Like whether you think of it as phones or transportation or infrastructures, or whether you think of it as animals and companion species, or the many animals we kill to live and so on, it became naturalized. So now we're great at that multiplicity too. At least many are. And more so with multi-species. And at Singh's intervention and Donna Haraway's interventions with multi-species. And now as soon as people started thinking about it, it's obvious, like we're absolutely surrounded by creatures everywhere that we live with, and some often can't live without. So we're good at multiplicity. Now, just the critical zone multiplicities are of another order and harder a little bit still, because it takes us into the realm of energy flows and nutrient flows and so on. And surely, again, we cannot interview them in the same way, so we have to find a way of, and also I'm not going for a walk with my dog sometimes, but I'm not going for a walk with an energy flow. Like, how are you going to get hold of it? So it poses puzzles. But I think, as you know, people are beginning to figure out and think about like how to get that kind of multiplicity into view. And then you have the final one that concerns all the other beings, the jinns, and the ghosts, and the ancestors, and the earth beings, and the devils and whatever they are in different parts of the world. Anthropologists have long been good at dealing with those, but I think the challenge here in terms of theory is that they've been mainly good at dealing with them as belief systems. And as soon as you have a belief system, it's not really a real thing. It's real for those people, but it's not really real. So you easily have a contradiction here where anthropologists, despite talking about these things, will not really take them seriously. I mean that Clifford Geertz, for example, who wrote about religion close to here, he made whole lists of what he said was all the interesting entities that Javanese people used to make sense of the mysterious parts of life, and they can even justify that among themselves. So in one sense, he's saying, well, he's documenting and being very respectful about the fact that there were all these different things, but in another sense, I feel it's really not very respectful, because it's clear as daylight that for him, the real world consists of what scientists find out about the natural universe. And so the Javanese, you guys, those of you who are Javanese, you could have your funny beliefs, that's very interesting, but it doesn't have a real hold on reality. That's a problem for dealing with multiplicity, because once you send that into the realm of beliefs, then you've lowered it. Ultimately, you cannot have a discussion between a quantum physicist and a Javanese mystic, if they still exist, because one is talking about reality and one is talking about something else that's not real. And the intervention with pluriversal concept zones that came out particularly with the Latins is that the earth beings that were not mountains, they did come to make a real claim on reality in Peruvian politics. And that forced a lot of difficult engagements and discussions around problems of coexistence. What can it be if that's an earth being? I live with an earth being, but you see a mountain full of minerals and you like to cut it off. That's a very difficult problem of coexistence. Once you have leveled the field, and you can't just say, yeah, that's because you're superstitious anymore. And so I think the rise of indigenous thinking is going to cause more and more of those problems. And the ways in which anthropologists can help to deal with that is by refusing to relegate it to a domain of belief where it actually doesn't count at the end of the day. At the end of the day, it's this one, but it's not that one. That, I think, is a problem of tackling multiplicity. How can you do it equally? And I'll just say, as a side thing on that, because you used some nice language, but I think we can change it slightly. What did you say? You said, I talked about a variety of worlds, and you said something like, when you have them next to each other in a way, you have a sort of in-between space, I think, and you said liminal, and things could collide, and surely things can collide, but I'm not sure that you have is necessarily a liminal in-between space, because if you think about earth beings and mountains, what's in between them? There's nothing liminal, right? They're distinctive things. So the idea is more like layers in a certain sense. There's one world, but there's another world on top of it. It's slightly different, and part of the things can articulate together without any problem, but other things cannot articulate at all. So this kind of leveled, stacked worlds are interesting. I'm sure you could find it innumerable places in Jakarta, even, just like there's this modern world here full of infrastructure and impossible.
Anasing call it scale, right? Anasing call it scale. Scale.
She called, yes, yeah, in a way that it's related to that.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, within what she talks about, the
Scalable.
the scalability of the modern worlds, right? Then you have the crevices where something else is also there, but it's unseen by the scale.
Measure.
Yeah. So I think but the thing also is, these days I think she's not so good with with the spirits as she used to be. I mean, she's very into the natural history stuff now. I do love and admire it, but it's when you're tracing mushrooms,
mud.
and plantations and so on. It's very difficult to. I feel it's difficult for her to find a way of making room for the things that don't belong in that kind of nature. Even though, I mean, she has the good, in my opinion, attack on the scalability of certain kinds of systems, basically of domination. I like it. And her sort of invigoration of ecologies, feral ecologies, and all this, I like it a lot. But I do think that some of the other beings that also inhabit these landscapes are sort of relegated to the sidelines. Yes, that interests me, right? And I don't think it's necessary, but I think that's posing for me the problem of like how to deal with all of the things at the same time, because now I won't talk like Indonesia is too complicated and maybe foreign for me, but let's say, I mean, in Cambodia, for example, they have potent landscapes with land protecting beings and so on, and they also have a lot of bulldozers and chainsaws, and they also have a lot of animals, and it's easy to deal with, in a way, the critique of deforestation from the environmental point of view that you're destroying ecology, but it's much more difficult in a certain sense to deal with the fact that you're destroying the potent landscapes and the land protectors, except if you say, well, it's really a symbol for nature. So there's this tendency of turning it into a part of an understandable nature to make room for it. And that's, I think, what Marisol is calling for example, is like with the earth beings are different kinds of things that demand respect, and it's not respectful to fit them, to force them into our categories. They demand respect in the sense that they're impossible to our categories, but they have a right to be there because they are there with these people that live there in the forests or in the mountains. That, I think, now of course we just keep talking about the same question really, but that's the issue. It's sort of how to keep adding more multiplicity without lowering any of the forms. So notice, I never said now contact zones is a bad idea. I still think it's a very good idea. I'll never be unhappy with anybody studying contact zones. But there's more, but there's more, but there's more. You could also start from earth beings, but you could not end up with ignoring people. That would also be a lack, right? I mean, so it's this kind of radical empiricism that is willing to take everything into account without relegating anything to a lower position. And I think that's William James' term, another Westerner. But I think when we don't know how to do it well, and that relates to the speculations also, I think. Because that's in terms of the speculations, I think part of the thing is we don't know how to do it well. Exactly. We don't necessarily have the right conceptual grips, so people are shopping around and looking everywhere. And I think it's enriching. It's also quite chaotic right now. So people come up with too many like good ideas and bad ideas. But I think, did you use this language also, or did I just imagine it? Were you talking some about taking care of the possible?
Yeah.
So it's Isabel Stenger's, right?
Yeah, because maybe in some sense that when in some other context when I'm doing research in Indonesia, when people talking about the speculation, they are talking also about the taking care of the future.
No, absolutely. But I think this is, for me, this is it's one of my favorite mantras of the last many years. Is Isabel Stenger's Belgian philosopher and close associate with Latour when he was alive, and author of the magnificent books called Cosmopolitics. And she uses this phrase of taking care of the possible, which could be the motto of this, because taking care of the possible is not exactly dealing with the probable. We know the probable very well, we're good at it, and the probable almost always these days look quite bad. Things are going badly in so many ways. It's probably going to be the same or worse later on. And there's a kind of deadening thing to always focusing on the invariable deterioration of stuff in that manner. So Stengel's philosophy is much absorbed by speculatively creating room for not letting go of what is still possible. Like what is still sitting there virtually, or could be there in how people are doing things, or what you could see them to be doing, and in the possibilities of new connections and portals between practices. And it's speculative in the sense that it doesn't necessarily exist yet.
Sorry, I have to cut you. Maybe we can move on. Yes, to the open discussion.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you for the discussion. I think it was really interesting. So before we move on to the open discussion, maybe I try to summarize just a bit about what we have just discussed. So I think we did a lot of deconstructing today, deconstructing about the Anthropocene, about epistemologies and about ontologies, how we understand the world right now. We need to, maybe if I could borrow a term from Latour as well, because I really like his terminology. It's like we tend to think about the world we live in, the world that we imagine, but we tend to not think about the world we live from, like the world that we actually step our foot on. And I think that's a really nice way to summarize the discussion. And I will open the floor to the audience if there's any questions or comments, both for audience in the room and audience that attend through the Zoom meeting. Maybe you can use the chat feature. And yeah, if there's any questions or comments, yeah.
Iya, perlu biar kedengar di Zoom.
Thank you very much. I get a lot of insight, very interesting insight from your presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation. But I would like to get, the benefit of the doubt from my question and perhaps your answer. Your project remind me with the project like long time ago, not in the same kind, but France was historical particularism. Perhaps you're aware of that. So try to know a lot of diversity of culture in the world. In the same, this project almost like the same thing. How to see people has their own episteme to deal with the world and try to learn from that. But the thing is, for me, this kind of project has two double sides of the sword, double edge of the sword. There are many interesting things that we can learn, but also there is also a kind of trap, I think. If you have too much conceptual term, and then we getting confused and get hazy, and then we don't know how to do in dealing with this practical thing. With the problem, planetary problem that we face now. Because, of course, as anthropology also aware of that, we are very aware of the cultural relativism, right? So we learn from people culture. So perhaps other discipline is not like anthropology, but anthropology is kind of our doctrine. So we learn from people, epistemology. So I just want to know your opinion about Edward Kohn. How foresting, the Sylvan thinking. So it is not enough. We learn from this. Do you include Edward Kohn as a northern Anthropocene, or I don't know? For me, the term is not really important. So for myself. But of course, I learn a lot from what you're saying. But a lot of things that also very, very good in in Western science. I learned a lot from Karl Marx. I learned a lot from many things. But the thing is, the thing that we have to concern, like you know the planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Resilience Center. There are 9 planetary boundaries, right? The ozone depletion, ocean what? I forget. All what is pengasaman? Acidification, the land use, the shift of land use, the shift of freshwater use, and many things. So just seeing this in the planetary perspective and try to solve the problem is already very difficult for us to take action as a, how do you call it, as a human, one citizen of the world. But when we try to see it differently and with many variables, it makes it harder, right? I just want to compare this situation. So even seeing homogeneity is already very hard to heal our planet. So seeing again with many different varieties is much more harder. So how do you think about that? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Sorry for babbling on so much. You had to cut me off. Well, there were several different interesting points. First, I think that I do hope that I said that I definitely have a lot of respect for the sciences, which are right here in the middle with the critical zones, with all their flows. Of course, planetary boundaries is also, it's not exactly the same, but it's very important to know these things. I talked about the great acceleration with all these curves going on. It would be a mistake not to take many sciences very seriously now, but at the same time, they do not fully determine everything that is to be said about the conditions we all live in, and I think that's also the case, so that you cannot only, especially as an anthropologist, you cannot only defer to what the scientists are saying about what is the planetary situation. And that's empirically the case, of course, also because if everybody took what the scientists were saying very seriously, we would all change our behaviors drastically right now, and we don't. So they might have the right knowledge, but they don't. They're not believed in a certain sense. But I'm not saying anything negative about the sciences. One of the portals I imagined, for example, was ways in which the colonial or decolonial projects could learn from science rather than being necessarily antagonistic. But also the scientists would have to learn from the decolonials about their own histories in order to perform themselves. Stenger's term is to become more civilized by not elevating themselves to the, again her terms, thinking heads of mankind, but as collectives that need to work with others to figure out what are the ways of existing in this world. And that's not, so I don't disagree with the importance of the sciences at all. It's simply about there's room for learning many more things. Now, so one thing you said was that, okay, particularism, there's so many things going on, we risk becoming confused. Now that is surely the case, but at the same time, I think we're already very confused. We're already very confused, and so I don't know if it's. I wouldn't want to say we're not confused enough. That's not the point, but we're already very confused, and the mega categories that are used to make sense of the situation is not really proving to make things less confusing. So that's my take on it. But I think the point is also like, I would not say, like there's a difference between the sort of analysis I might do myself for a chapter or a book on some of these topics, which would be particular in theory use and in what it was about, obviously. And the kind of panorama I've tried to sketch here, which is a sort of collective situation, I think, where many things are going on, and there are many possibilities. For the point of particularity, like how to say, it's not a matter of finding ways of making a new mega category. I don't think so. The Anthropocene did not work well. Planetary boundaries have not prevented the planetary boundaries from being breached. The great acceleration has not prevented acceleration, and the capital C diagnosis has also not prevented anything. So it's not a matter of trying a category that will solve the problem. What I would more imagine in terms of how I'm imagining this is more in terms of potential relays between different kinds of problems. And that is, for example, as I said, like maybe contrary to what a Danish person might think, the kinds of situation and problems Danes are facing today could be illuminated by very different things that are going on in Jakarta or India. We don't know. There's not even a possibility. It could require specific intellectual interventions and forms of curiosity to learn how that could work or not. But since it's a fact that in Denmark we don't know how to do a great many things, nobody has really figured out how to solve the Danish climate problems. Everybody's circulating the same conceptual ideas in the social sciences and the same political ideas in the political realm, and still business as usual continues. It seems that there are rich untapped possibilities for trying to learn something quite different from areas and ways of thinking that we are not familiar with. I think that's it. So it's this, the ethnomethodologies for living in many places are under threat. So, and people in many places are confused about who they are and what they are, looking for infusions of other ideas. I think this connects with the speculations as well, and that's my take on it. So along that, just 1 second, Eduardo Kohn is one, he fits, I mean, I put him in here, he's forced semiotics. I mean, I find it problematic in some ways, but I also find it beautiful in some ways. I don't want to have a fight with Eduardo Kohn about that. I'm not that interested in Charles Peirce's semiotics, but I think some of the things he's describing is exceptionally interesting. It could be interesting to think with some of Kohn's ideas in other forests in the world, but not uncreatively. It would have to be modified, right? And I think he would have to be open to modification too, because maybe one of the problems with him is that he kind of presents how forests think as a universal category. Forests thinks with Peircean semiotics. I mean, that's where my problem comes in. So he's a friend, but all friends are not identical. I mean, that's,
sorry. About the Eduardo Kohn, right? Our problem now is we think too much in the symbolical framework. And we need the complementary of it is the imagery thinking. Right? So like people in Amazon, like in Jakarta, in Java, when you say something entering the water, we call it pure, something like that, right? Just like the thing entering the water. So it is not symbolic, but more imagery. The direction, the relation between the word and the reality is direct. Indexical in Pierre's term. So symbolic is no direct relationship between the symbol and the thing that it symbolizes. So one of the remedy for humankind, I think, is to complement symbolic thinking with the imagery thinking that work like that, and like with the playfulness, mimicking, something like that.
So in absentia, so you see something that is not an absent in you and try to make a synthesized and balance. It is how the words work. The Unicode is work. Try to find the semiosis relation between all of the things in the world, human and not human. I mean, so it is one of the learn that we can take from Eduardo Kohn, and it is, I think, it is universal, not only for Amazon people, but it's also applied to all of us. Yes, sorry, thank you.
People can fight over whether it's universal or not. I'm not sure. I think so, but I don't think it's necessarily that important either. I think what I hear from you is extremely interesting and even wonderful, and I didn't hear this before about the view. So I think that probably is not quite identical to how the people in Ecuador, where he was, are dealing with it, with their dogs and monkeys, but it's also not entirely the same. So there's a kind of transformational quality when you take that and turn it into, adapt it to Japanese terminologies, and that's that's what I'm talking about. That's extremely interesting. And there could also be other things, but I would personally love to learn more about that. And it could be interesting how that would qualify or could qualify ways of thinking about water or other things, say in the critical zones. It would not be easy, but it might be important.
Yeah.
Okay, Casper, thanks for this fascinating lecture and response to our questions. And I'm just trying to situate how this lecture will, I'm trying to connect what you offer in this lecture, and we will try to explore more on your book, of course, with our existing academic and intellectual project at the Department of Anthropology at Universitas Indonesia. And I'm thinking here as the chair of the department, I'm thinking here also about the plan of expanding and exploring ways of paradigmatic and engagement of the cluster of research at our department. So we have these three clusters, one talking about bodies, one talking about spaces, living spaces, the other one is talking about traditions and ontology. So we have our own terminology for our public engagement, but overall in terms of conceptual ground of these three clusters, we talk about body, we talk about space, and we talk about ontology and culture and epistemology. And I'm thinking about your invitations on these presentations, and I'm really interested with your concept on this pluriversal context zone. We have the last meeting on the chair of the three cluster, thinking about what kind of intellectual agenda in the next 10 years in terms of theoretical directions of Indonesian anthropology. And we are thinking about, this is still not being agreed upon between the chair cluster and me, but we start by talking about frontiers, not in a sense of this colonial perspective about frontiers, but frontiers in terms of a space of exactly about pluriversal context zones. And we are thinking about exploring diverse, as you may say, these portals on this, because we are talking about, me, myself, are exploring the concept of medical frontiers with Mazewan, and the other colleague talking about also as well about cosmopolitics and everything related with the indigenous politics and new extractivism, and others talking about the state interventions about indigeneity itself. And I'm thinking about a dialogue between what we already done about this term to see whether there is a cross-section between what you talk about in pluriversal context zone and what we are thinking about the frontiers as a term, as an entry point to go further about what we are trying to offer as an institution. I'm just curious with your response about what we already talked about. Of course, this is not a final decision. First, we are planning to write something on this and reflecting on what we already published about what we think, what our perspective are about the subject of studies. Of course, we are already beyond culture ideas about what we studied, and we start by discussing about the frontiers as a place of not just talking about the contact zone and emerging as in the book about the interface, about coexistence, but we are thinking also about the consequence of the interface and interface and consequences. We talk about the term mutation. We also talk about the terms of hybridity and everything. So what is your response with that kind of term? The frontiers term, the place where improvisation and a zone of possibilities emerging and forming some kind of, I learned from Estonia actually, some kind of seismogenetic process of changing form of different world. So what do you think about it with what our existing discussions about our intellectual project, about the frontiers as a term? Thanks.
It's very interesting, and I'm not sure if I can just sort of immediately do justice to all your discussions, which have obviously been going on for a long time. But if I try to sort of quickly connect it, I would say now I didn't put there's no frontier headlines in this book, but it doesn't mean there are no frontiers. I mean, there are many frontiers. People are discussing a variety of frontiers, and I think one reason I didn't put it is because there's been many frontier studies is a whole thing. Like, there's limited how many different people you should step on the toes of in one book. But I would say that frontiers as sort of transformational spaces are probably also often pluriversal. That is, the pluriverse rather than the universe just means that there's several worlds in one, right? Like, or even better, now I used pluriverse here because it's in Escobar and Marisol's work together, but I personally often like Marisol and Mario Plaza's term uncommons, even better uncommons. If you have a commons, and there's been a lot of discussion in activism here and there about commoning, that is preventing working against enclosures and all this, and I think that's surely very important. But there's also a risk and a danger of the sort of commonality and identity, notions of identities that come with having in common consensus, being in agreement and so on. So the uncommons is the coexistence in spaces where things are never going to be the same. And I think both pluriverse, the frontiers are obviously like, it's places where you're pushing into, in a certain sense, if you think about the Old West, right? Now this was the frontier, now we push further in and harass and kill more Indians and further and so on. So each time you have a frontier, there's a boundary between the new and the old, the known and the unknown, depending on which side you're on. So it's always a contact zone, and it's always probably a critical zone in the sense that critically important encounters are going on, and many things are in a critical condition. We don't know what's going to happen. Are people going to die or not? Are they going to coexist? Are they going to kill each other? And it's often pluriversal, both in cultural terms and maybe in ontological terms, and in several levels. So I do think that sounds good and super interesting to me. It also seems just like, from how you're saying it, that potentially it sounds like there are cross-cutting possibilities.
Yes, and not just talk about spatial.
Because, I mean, when it comes to the bodies, I mean, bodies of many kinds, human and non-human and more than human, have encounters at frontiers that are not the same that they would have in other places. They're running into new things, and bodies transform when they encounter new things. If you think about space, obviously, there's this kind of push, a sort of sheerly geographical push spatial, but there's also a kind of, maybe relating to something we've been doing together, there's a kind of entanglement and transformation of spatialities. Like some new kinds of areas are emerging where frontiers are being pushed and where new relations are formed. So spatialities are in the making, just as bodies are in the making. It's not just encroachments, it's also metamorphosis, at least potentially, and destruction, of course. And now I can't remember what the third cluster was. It was...
Yeah, I'm still trying to figuring out the third one, because the term of the cluster is traditions and indigeneity, but we are talking about ontology, about traditions.
But if we just say, like, if we sort of superficially mesh things together and say there are different cultural ways of living together that are different on the side of the frontiers, obviously. There are different ways of knowing, so different epistemologies, and there are different compositions of the world, so there are different ontologies. All of that meet, right, per definition, that meet at a frontier also, which is why it is an uncommon and pluralist. So I do think that you have sort of bodies, forms of area, or forms of regions, or forms of space, and forms of knowledge and existence are all sort of up in the air. But like in the old contact zones, it's under unequal conditions, right? Because usually when you're at a frontier, it's not everybody pushing equally from all sides. It's usually some people pushing in the direction and other people not doing anything or trying to kick them out again, right? So it's uneven. And there's a kind of drive in one direction, which creates surely problems of coexistence, at least, I mean, of many kinds. And depending on how normative one feels about it, it could then be a project figuring out how to prevent those who are doing the frontiering of being too destructive, right? Or it could be a more documentary, like. But anyway, I think it's quite. It sounds very rich and exciting.
And that's the reasons also we are thinking also about not just explaining about, but explaining with, and also engage within the pluriversal contact zone as an academic institution. So we are also involved with civil society and also so many knowledge institutions that perhaps really influential in that what we call frontier zones.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Maybe other space and conceptual.
Yeah. Mungkin yang lain atau yang Zoom atau apa aja.
Space and conceptual. Body.
Okay, so Mas Imam's question will be our last question for today's lecture. It's already 11 o'clock.
Maybe we can have 10 minutes if there is one question.
Masih ada yang mau nanya?
Okay, maybe one more question. Maybe if there's question in Zoom, I think.
Kalau nggak ada nggak apa-apa.
So if
Mas Fajar.
Too short, not question, but actually try to engage with your point and discussions. And the first one, I like to probably like you to, maybe you can elaborate more on the notion, on the context of the space. Because we've been, as you mentioned, we've been working with this kind of thinking about what actually area means. But at the same time, then the ideas that we've been trying to start with is the idea of Tongchai's geobody. And we try to kind of expand it a little bit to include some more kind of STS perspective and other kind of bodily enactments that are included in the conceptualization of what we understand as an area of space. So if you can maybe elaborate more about that. And the second one is, I think in terms of you haven't been talk much about the methodology, because you pointed out one thing, very interesting thing, is that how do we interview the train, for example. It's the same kind of things that I encounter when I working on the cats. There are always people talking. Even anthropologists also talking. How do you get the interview the perspective of the cats? I think this is one of the methodology, the problem of methodology that we need to also discuss in the futures. Not only meaning and not only recognizing that something there, but how to bring that something there into our conversations. And this is something that the idea, for example, like we've been talking about the sensibility, sensory is one of the things we can use as methodological angle to understand this kind of a universal world. Thank you.
Okay, I try to reply quickly. For the methodology, I think I'm gonna. I agree it's important, but I think I'm gonna skip it for John because I don't think it's answerable in a general manner. Like, for example, in this book, which is a lot of chapters, but not the whole world, it's just some chapters. People use many methods depending on what they're studying. I think for multi-species anthropology, there are already numerous proposed methods with their strengths and weaknesses, and they become more difficult and problematic when you're dealing with more than humans, that maybe you can't even see them clearly or you're not sure if they're there. But it's beyond me to say what all these methods are, so it's better not to sound silly by trying to say it. But I agree that's important discussions. Now for the other one, with the spatialities of the areas, I think this is how to connect it with the frontiers. It's very interesting to think of spatiality, area or region as emergent formations that are shaped by the relations and itineraries of many different kinds of beings. So instead of having a demarcated area where animals walk through and humans ride on motorbikes through and so on, which is obviously the case, thinking about how areas emerge from the relations happening there. Now, I know you did stuff on durian as constructing a particular kind of relationality due to its unique olfactory its smelliness and its characteristics that are appealing in some parts of the world and not in many others. So a form of area emerges around the durian, like Gedung and Chula has discussed how cattle trade, where cattle walk from Myanmar into Thailand, they die in principle when they cross the border, and then they re-emerge as Thai cows, and then they walk through. They don't die, right? They pretend they die, they disappear, then they get Thai papers. So they're reinvented as Thai cows, and they walk through the landscape, get medical treatment, and get fattened until they walk up into China and they become hot pots. So you have like this kind of area that's defined by food preferences of a particular kind and legislations and moving bodies, sensations and affects relating to Chinese food preferences. From that emerges, it's not a frontier, but it's a weird kind of culinary multi-species area that generates something that doesn't conform to any demarcation you can see on a map, because it's a bit of Myanmar, a bit of China, and a bit of northern Thailand. And that's interesting, I think, the kind of how particular, then you'd be able to think about multiple spatialities coexisting, because of course in the same areas there are many other things going on than the cows walking. There are also plants and mazes being grown and forest fires. So the notion that you can have entangled areas and that they're layered with each other and that they're produced by the movements of different bodies according to different principles, whether it's Chinese food preference or Thai legislation or something else, is very interesting, I think. And it gives the possibility for thinking about the rhythms of emerging areas. Like sometimes it's undulating or modulating, sometimes it's fast and slow, sometimes if you have violence going on, it's intense, and at other times it's quiet, not much seems to be happening. So the effects that are part of making spaces through bodies and their knowledges all come together in a very interesting manner, I think. That's the best I can say right now.
Okay,
Thank you for the last discussion. So that will be our last question for today's lecture. I thank you everyone for joining the lectures today. But before we formally close this lecture, maybe Casper could give like a closing statement for us.
I don't think I need to give a closing statement. I talk too much, but
buy the book and read.
the closing statement is just to say thank you so much for having me here, and I hope some of it was interesting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we could take a picture together for documentation. Maybe everyone can get in front. Thank you.
Biasanya Jumat orang males ngajar.